John Wayne Gacy was a real-life nightmare hiding behind a painted smile. Known as the Killer Clown, Gacy worked as a respected businessman by day and performed as Pogo the Clown at local events. But behind the facade, he was a sadistic predator who lured young men and boys to their deaths. Between 1972 and 1978, Gacy raped, tortured, and murdered at least 33 victims, most of whom he buried under his suburban Chicago home. Gacy's method was particularly sinister. He lured victims with job offers or promises of alcohol, then handcuffed and overpowered them. He often tricked them into wearing the cuffs, pretending it was part of a magic trick. Once restrained, Gacy unleashed his depravity. He strangled his victims with a makeshift tourniquet, calling it the rope trick, while he sexually assaulted them. He took pleasure in their terror, often prolonging their suffering for his gratification. Many of his victims were buried so tightly under his house that investigators had to exhume the remains in layers. The stench of decay eventually led police to his gruesome lair. In December 1978, a search of Gacy's home revealed body after body buried in the crawl space, with additional victims dumped in nearby rivers. Convicted of 33 murders, Gacy was executed in 1994, but his case remains one of the most horrifying in American history, a reminder that monsters can wear a smile. In the sleepy, isolated town of Plainfield, Wisconsin, Ed Gein was the quiet man who kept to himself. Most neighbors saw him as the oddball handyman, someone to pity more than fear. But when a local woman vanished without a trace, whispers turned into suspicion, and authorities began looking for answers. On a cold November evening, police arrived at Gein's dilapidated farmhouse. The stench hit them first, thick, sour, and unnatural. Inside, they discovered a scene that defied belief, like a nightmare come to life. Human remains lay scattered, repurposed as horrifying relics. Chairs and lampshades made of skin, a belt sewn from severed human noses, and a soup bowl fashioned from a skull. In the corner, they found a suit stitched together from flesh, carefully tailored, waiting for him to wear. As they pieced together his gruesome trophies, investigators learned Gein had been exhuming graves for years, practicing a morbid ritual to bring his dead mother back to life. On some nights, when that wasn't enough, he took fresh victims. Ed Gein's twisted crimes would inspire some of horror's darkest icons, but no one could fully capture the horror of what lay behind his quiet, unassuming smile. To this day, Plainfield remembers him as the man who turned his home into a graveyard, a monument to madness and death. In the darkest corners of their minds, they wonder if Gein's spirit still wanders those woods, watching from the shadows, waiting to finish what he started. Ted Bundy was evil, hiding in plain sight. In the 1970s, he charmed his way into the lives of young women, using fake injuries, crutches, or a cast to appear harmless. Once close enough, he struck, knocking them unconscious and dragging them into the night. Bundy's crimes were far more than murder. He desecrated his victims, returning to their remains to pose and groom their bodies as if they were dolls. Severed heads were found in his apartment, trophies of his twisted obsession. He targeted women across 7 states, carefully evading capture while leaving a trail of fear. In 1975, police stopped Bundy, discovering handcuffs, rope, and a crowbar in his car. It was only the beginning. Even after being arrested, Bundy escaped twice, once leaping from a courthouse window and later breaking out of jail entirely. During his second escape, he unleashed unspeakable terror in Florida, killing 2 women in a sorority house and abducting a 12-year-old girl. When Bundy was finally caught, his trial became a spectacle, with him arrogantly acting as his own lawyer. He confessed to 30 murders before his execution in 1989. though experts believe he killed far more. Ted Bundy wasn't just a killer. He was a master manipulator, a monster who hid behind a smile. His story serves as a chilling reminder. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones you'd never suspect. Jeffrey Dahmer, the Milwaukee cannibal, shocked the world with his grotesque crimes. Between 1978 and 1991, he murdered 17 men and boys, targeting vulnerable individuals, many of whom he met in bars or lured to his apartment under false pretenses. Dahmer didn't just kill, his acts were monstrous. He drugged his victims, strangled them, and then desecrated their bodies. He kept body parts, including skulls and organs, in his apartment as twisted trophies. He experimented with preserving remains and even engaged in necrophilia and cannibalism. His freezer was found filled with body parts, and his walls were adorned with chilling reminders of his crimes. Dahmer's depravity extended to attempts at creating zombies. He drilled holes in his victims' skulls and injected acid or boiling water, hoping to turn them into mindless slaves. His heinous acts ended in 1991 when one of his intended victims escaped, leading police to his nightmarish apartment. Dahmer confessed to his crimes in shocking detail, showing no remorse. Convicted of 16 murders, he was sentenced to life imprisonment, where he met his end in 1994 at the hands of another inmate. His story is a harrowing reminder of unimaginable evil hiding in plain sight. Aileen Wuornos was one of the most notorious female serial killers in the United States. Her killing spree, which lasted from 1989 to 1990, saw the murder of 7 men in Florida. Her victims, all middle-aged men, were shot at point-blank range in remote locations, their bodies left discarded along highways. Wuornos, a prostitute, claimed that she killed these men in self-defense after they attempted to sexually assault her. Wuornos's early life was tragic, marked by abandonment, abuse, and violence. Born in 1956, she was raised by her abusive maternal grandparents after her mother abandoned her as a child. At the age of 13, Wuornos was sexually assaulted by her grandfather, and she soon turned to prostitution to survive. Her rough upbringing and the horrors she endured would shape her worldview, and by the time she began killing, Wuornos was deeply troubled. Her first murder occurred in 1989 when she shot and killed Richard Mallory, a convicted rapist whom she had picked up as a client. Over the next year, she continued killing men, claiming they tried to assault her. However, investigators found evidence that suggested she may have been lying and that her killings were not solely in self-defense. Wuornos was eventually arrested in 1991 after a witness saw her vehicle near one of the crime scenes. During her trial, Wuornos pleaded guilty to 6 of the 7 murders. Her defense, led by her lawyer, argued that she had suffered severe abuse and was a victim of a harsh, predatory world. Wuornos was sentenced to death for her crimes, and after spending over a decade on death row, she was executed by lethal injection on October 9, 2002. Her case sparked intense debates over the intersection of mental illness, abuse, and justice. Wuornos was often portrayed as a victim of Richard Ramirez, known as the Night Stalker, terrorized California with a spree of brutal and random crimes from June 1984 to August 1985. Born in 1960 in El Paso, Texas, Ramirez's troubled childhood was marked by exposure to violence and criminal influences. A deeply disturbing influence was his cousin Miguel, a Vietnam War veteran who boasted about atrocities he committed during the war, and even murdered his wife in front of Ramirez. This exposure to violence likely contributed to the formation of his sinister psyche. Ramirez's crimes began with the murder of 79-year-old Jenny Vincow, whose body was found in her ransacked Los Angeles apartment. Over the next year, Ramirez broke into homes at night, targeting women, men, and children with no discernible pattern, making him exceptionally difficult to profile. His methods were shockingly brutal, beating, stabbing, shooting, and sexually assaulting his victims. He left behind satanic symbols, such as pentagrams, and forced survivors to swear allegiance to Satan. These elements of the occult heightened public fear and created a mythic aura around his crimes. By mid-1985, police began linking the crimes through shoe prints from a rare Avier sneaker Ramirez wore and evidence left at the scenes. Public panic escalated as the media covered the gruesome details. A critical breakthrough came when a survivor provided a composite sketch, and Ramirez's fingerprints from a stolen car matched police records. On August 30th, 1985, after being publicly identified, Ramirez fled but was spotted in East Los Angeles. A group of civilians recognized him and detained him until police arrived. He was later convicted of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. Sentenced to death, Ramirez remained unrepentant. On Christmas Eve, 1945, the Sodder family's home in Fayetteville, West Virginia, went up in flames. George and Jenny Sodder, along with 4 of their children, escaped. But 5 children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, were believed to have perished in the fire, yet no remains were ever found. After the fire was extinguished, authorities concluded it had been caused by faulty wiring. But the Sodders noticed strange inconsistencies. The phone lines had been cut. The ladder, usually propped against the house, was missing and later found in a ditch. George's trucks, which he intended to use to save his children, wouldn't start. Even stranger, a witness reported seeing the missing children alive in a car during the fire. Years later, Jenny received a photograph in the mail of a young man resembling her missing son, Louis, with a cryptic note on the back. The Sodders became convinced their children had been kidnapped, possibly due to George's outspoken criticism of Mussolini and tensions in the local Italian immigrant community. The case was never solved, leaving a haunting question. Did the Sodder children die in the fire, or were they taken? The family's efforts to uncover the truth persisted until their deaths, leaving the mystery alive. The Zodiac Killer was more than a murderer. He was a terror that loomed over Northern California in the late 1960s. His crimes were as brazen as they were brutal, and his taunting letters left investigators and the public haunted for decades. His spree began on December 20th, 1968, when Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday, 2 teenagers on their first date, were ambushed on a secluded road. The killer shot both at close range before vanishing into the night. Just months later, on July 4th, 1969, he struck again. Darlene Ferrin and Michael Mageau were sitting in a car when the Zodiac unleashed a hail of gunfire. Mageau survived, offering a fleeting glimpse of a man whose shadow would darken California forever. In September 1969, he donned a macabre black hood with his signature symbol, a circle with a cross. On the shores of Lake Berryessa, he tied up Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard before stabbing them repeatedly with a foot-long knife. Shepard died. Hartnell survived to recount the horror. The Zodiac's cruelty peaked with his final confirmed murder. On October 11, 1969, he hailed a taxi in San Francisco, shot the driver, Paul Stein, in the back of the head, and calmly wiped the car of fingerprints. Witnesses saw him walking away, but he slipped through the police's grasp. What made the Zodiac infamous were his letters, chilling messages sent to newspapers, laced with cryptograms and confessions. In one letter he wrote, "I am not afraid of the gas chamber because it will send me to paradise all the sooner." One of his ciphers, decoded only in 2020, revealed his glee in killing and contempt for those hunting him. Despite claiming 37 victims, only 5 murders are confirmed. Dozens of suspects have been investigated, but his identity remains a ghostly enigma. In 1888, the shadowed streets of London's Whitechapel district became a killing ground for one of history's most notorious serial killers, Jack the Ripper. Over 3 months, he claimed the lives of 5 women, leaving behind fear, mystery, and countless unanswered questions. The nightmare began on August 31st, when Mary Ann Nichols was found lifeless on a dimly lit street. Her throat had been cut with precision, a hallmark of the Ripper's later crimes. A week later, Annie Chapman's body was discovered in a yard, her death showing signs of both violence and surgical skill, raising fears that the killer might be a doctor. On September 30th, the Ripper escalated his spree with a double murder. Elizabeth Stride was his first victim that night, though her wounds suggested he was interrupted. Hours later, Catherine Eddowes was found nearby, her death more calculated. A piece of her clothing was left near a chilling message scrawled in chalk, heightening the sense that the Ripper was toying with authorities. His final victim, Mary Jane Kelly, was killed on November 9th in her small apartment. This time, the crime scene was more horrific than the others, suggesting the Ripper had taken his time. After Kelly's murder, the killings stopped, leaving behind a city gripped in fear and speculation. Despite extensive investigations, letters taunting the police, and numerous suspects, Jack the Ripper's identity remains one of history's most haunting mysteries. In February 1957, a boy's lifeless body was found in a cardboard box in a wooded area of Philadelphia. He was estimated to be between 3 and 7 years old, his small frame malnourished and bruised. He had been beaten and left naked in the box, wrapped in a thin blanket. His hair had been crudely cut, possibly after death, and his identity remains unknown to this day. The box he was found in once contained a bassinet, leading investigators to believe he might have been abandoned by someone who purchased it. The boy's body showed signs of long-term abuse, with scars and bruises on his frail body. Despite exhaustive efforts, including distributing over 400,000 flyers of his image, no one came forward to identify him. Theories abound, ranging from a child sold by desperate parents to a victim of an illegal orphanage or a family hiding a shameful secret. Each lead only deepened the mystery. Decades later, forensic advances have brought new hope. But the boy's name, his story, and the reason for his tragic fate remain locked in silence. The boy in the box is a haunting reminder of how some victims are not just forgotten, they are never even known. On January 15, 1947, a horrific discovery shook Los Angeles. The body of 22-year-old aspiring actress Elizabeth Short, later known as the Black Dahlia, was found in a vacant lot, her murder so gruesome it became one of the most infamous cases in history. Her body was severed in half at the waist, drained of blood, and carefully posed. Her face had been slashed ear to ear in a macabre Glasgow smile, and her organs removed. Yet there was no blood at the scene, suggesting she had been killed elsewhere and transported. Elizabeth was last seen alive 6 days earlier, allegedly leaving a Los Angeles hotel. Known for her striking beauty and Hollywood ambitions, she became the perfect symbol for a city of dreams and its darkest nightmares. The case immediately drew massive media attention. Elizabeth, dubbed the Black Dahlia, due to her love of dark clothing, became a legend. The LAPD received dozens of letters from individuals claiming to be the killer, taunting authorities with cryptic clues. Despite extensive investigations and numerous suspects, including doctors, actors, and even police officers, no one was ever charged. The case remains open, a haunting reminder of a life cut tragically short and a killer who was never brought to justice. Robert Hansen appeared to be a quiet, unassuming baker in Anchorage, Alaska, but he harbored a horrifying secret. Over more than a decade, Hansen abducted at least 17 women, flying them in his private plane to remote areas of the Alaskan wilderness. There, he released them and hunted them like animals, armed with a rifle and a knife. Hansen targeted sex workers and vulnerable women, whom he lured with promises of money or work. His hunting trips were meticulously planned, and he kept detailed mementos from each victim, including their jewelry. Investigators later discovered a map marked with X's indicating where he buried his victims. The break in the case came in 1983 when a surviving victim escaped and provided critical information to authorities. After a thorough investigation, police found weapons and trophies from his victims in Hansen's home. He confessed to 17 murders and numerous assaults, ultimately receiving 461 years in prison without parole. Hansen's chilling crimes highlighted his methodical nature and his twisted need for control, making his story one of the most disturbing in U.S. history. Israel Keyes, one of the most enigmatic serial killers in recent history, was active across the United States from the late 1990s until his arrest in 2012. Known for his chilling precision and lack of an identifiable pattern, Keyes is thought to have killed at least 11 people, though the true number remains uncertain. Born in 1978 in Utah, Keyes grew up in a strict, isolated household. As a young man, he developed an obsession with control and power, which he later channeled into murder. Unlike many serial killers, Keyes avoided targeting specific types of victims. Instead, he chose people at random and relied on kill kits he had buried across the country to facilitate his crimes. Keyes' capture came after his final victim, 18-year-old Samantha Koenig, was abducted from a coffee stand in Anchorage, Alaska, in 2012. Keyes demanded a ransom after her death, using her bank card to withdraw money from ATMs across the U.S., which eventually led to his arrest. In custody, Keyes confessed to multiple murders, revealing a chilling level of preparation and forethought. He described flying to distant states, renting cars, and driving hundreds of miles to kill strangers, ensuring his crimes would be nearly impossible to trace. He also admitted to dismembering and disposing of bodies in ways that guaranteed they would never be found. Keyes took his secrets to the grave, committing suicide in his jail cell in December 2012 before police could uncover the full extent of his crimes. His death left many questions unanswered, making his case one of the most haunting mysteries in modern true crime. On October 22, 2005, Tara Grinstead, a beloved teacher and former beauty queen from Ocilla, Georgia, vanished without a trace. The last time anyone heard from her, she was getting ready for a pageant and planned to stay home that evening. But when her family went to check on her the next morning, her house was locked from the inside, with no signs of forced entry. Her car sat untouched outside. Her phone remained on the counter. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. As the investigation dragged on, strange details emerged. Neighbors recalled seeing a mysterious car near her house the night she disappeared, but no one could identify it. There were whispers of a secret lover, but no one knew for sure. The case went cold, and Tara's disappearance became a chilling ghost story that haunted the town for years. Then, in 2017, Ryan Duke, a former student, was arrested. He claimed to have been involved in her death, but his confession was eerie. He described hearing strange noises in the house, a voice calling out, but when he went to check, Tara was gone, like the house had swallowed her whole. Some believed Tara had been taken by something darker, something that had remained hidden in the shadows all along. To this day, no one knows what really happened to Tara Grinstead. The mystery remains, leaving the town of Ocilla in fear, forever wondering if the truth will ever be uncovered. For over a decade, Andrei Chikatilo, known as the Butcher of Rostov, terrorized the Soviet Union, brutally murdering at least 52 people between 1978 and 1990. Born in 1936 during Ukraine's famine, his childhood was filled with trauma, tales of cannibalism, and constant humiliation, experiences that shaped his monstrous future. His killing spree began in 1978 with the murder of 9-year-old Yelena Zakotnova. Chikatilo targeted the most vulnerable: children, women, and runaways. He lured victims at train stations with promises of food or money, taking them to remote areas where he stabbed, mutilated, and sometimes cannibalized them. He later admitted deriving sexual pleasure from their suffering. The investigation was plagued by errors. Another man was wrongfully executed for his first murder, and outdated forensics combined with Soviet denial of serial killers delayed his capture. Chikatilo evaded justice for years, emboldened by his ability to stay ahead of authorities. Finally, in November 1990, police caught him acting suspiciously near a train station. His blood type matched evidence from several crime scenes, ending his reign of terror. At his 1992 trial, Chikatilo confessed to 52 murders, describing the gruesome details with no remorse. He laughed, taunted families, and turned the courtroom into chaos. Sentenced to death, he was executed by gunshot in 1994, leaving behind a legacy of fear and suffering that still haunts true crime history. On May 3, 2007, 3-year-old Madeleine McCann was abducted from her family's vacation apartment in Praia da Luz, a resort town in Portugal. Her parents, Kate and Jerry McCann, along with their friends, were dining at a nearby restaurant when they left Madeleine and her twin siblings, Sean and Amelie, asleep in the apartment. Every 30 minutes, the parents checked on the children, but when Kate returned around 10 total p.m., Madeleine was gone. The apartment door was unlocked, and the window had been tampered with, leading police to believe it could be an abduction. The couple immediately alerted the authorities, sparking one of the largest manhunts in European history. Despite an extensive search and the involvement of local Portuguese and British police, Madeleine was never found. Early investigations focused on a number of theories, including the possibility of a local abduction or a trafficking ring. A major twist came in the form of a suspect, Robert Murat, a British-Portuguese man who lived nearby, but he was cleared after extensive questioning. In 2007, the Portuguese police declared the case closed, but it was reopened by the British police in 2011. Following new leads, in 2013, the McCanns hired private investigators, and further information emerged pointing to a series of potentially related disappearances of young children across Europe. In 2014, a German man named Christian B. was publicly linked to the case, though he denied involvement. The case was reopened again in 2020, with investigators speculating that Madeleine may have been abducted by a sex trafficking ring or murdered. The lack of solid evidence, coupled with various conflicting theories and the public's fascination, has made this case a subject of media frenzy, documentaries, and ongoing invest. In the quiet suburb of Port Coquitlam, British Columbia, a sprawling pig farm held a dark secret. For decades, women from Vancouver's downtown east side disappeared, vanishing into the night without a trace. Many were dismissed by authorities, poor, vulnerable, forgotten. But the truth was far worse than anyone imagined. The farm belonged to Robert Pickton, a local pig farmer with a reputation for being strange but unassuming. It wasn't until 2002, after years of rumors and whispers, that police uncovered the horror. What they found would haunt investigators for the rest of their lives. Pickton had lured his victims to the farm, promising drugs, money, or safety, only to turn it into their final resting place. Remains were found buried in the soil, others processed alongside the meat from his pigs. For years, no one suspected the horror hidden in plain sight. The farm had become a graveyard, and its owner, a monster masquerading as an ordinary man. Pickton later claimed he wanted to kill 50 women, but had messed up at 49. He confessed to blending human remains with pork from the farm and distributing it in the community, a detail that sent shockwaves through British Columbia. To this day, many wonder if all of his victims were truly uncovered or if some secrets remain buried beneath the farm's soil. Robert Pickton was convicted of 6 murders, but investigators believe the true number is far higher, making him one of Canada's most notorious serial killers. The pig farm is gone now, but the shadow of Pickton's crimes still lingers. A chilling reminder that sometimes evil hides in the most ordinary places. Gary Ridgway was convicted of 49 murders, though he confessed to 71 and hinted that the true number could be much higher. His reign of terror lasted over 2 decades, from 1982 to 2001, primarily in the Seattle area. Ridgway targeted vulnerable women, many of whom were sex workers or runaways. His method was chillingly methodical. He strangled his victims with ligatures and left their bodies in remote, wooded areas, many of them along the Green River, which earned him his grim nickname. What made Ridgway particularly disturbing was his ability to blend in as an average, nondescript man. He was a married father and worked as a truck painter. Despite his outwardly normal life, Ridgway's dark secret remained hidden for years as he carefully covered his tracks and avoided detection. The case went unsolved for nearly 2 decades, with investigators frustrated by a lack of solid evidence. Ridgway's capture was made possible in 2001 through advancements in DNA technology, which linked him to several of the victims. Ridgway eventually struck a plea deal, admitting to the murders in exchange for avoiding the death penalty, though he has expressed little remorse for his actions. His case remains one of the most haunting examples of how a serial killer can operate under the radar for years, hiding in plain sight. Dennis Rader's chilling moniker, BTK, describes his horrifying modus operandi. He would bind his victims, torture them, and then kill them. Between 1974 and 1991, Rader claimed the lives of 10 victims, ranging from children to adults, often invading their homes to carry out his crimes. Rader's attacks were meticulously planned. He stalked his victims for weeks, learning their routines and choosing his moments with precision. His first known attack in 1974 was particularly brutal. He broke into the home of the Sodder family, strangling both parents and their 2 young children. His thirst for control and domination drove his actions, and he later confessed that reliving these murders in his mind brought him satisfaction for years. What set Rader apart was his narcissistic need for recognition. He taunted police and media with letters detailing his crimes, relishing in the fear and notoriety he created. Despite his ego, Rader evaded capture for decades by living a double life. He was a respected community member, a church president, and a family man. The case went cold for years until 2004, when Rader reignited his communications with law enforcement. His arrogance led to his downfall in 2005, when a floppy disk he sent to the police was traced back to him. Rader's confession was chillingly devoid of remorse as he recounted his murders with cold precision. Now, serving 10 consecutive life sentences, Rader remains a haunting example of how evil can hide in plain sight. His story is a grim reminder of the masks that some people wear to conceal their true selves. Albert Fish, active in the early 1900s, was a seemingly harmless elderly man. In reality, he was a sadistic killer and cannibal who preyed on children, committing acts so horrifying they shocked even seasoned investigators. Fish claimed to have abducted, tortured, and murdered several children across the United States, though he was convicted of only one, Grace Budd. In 1928, Fish posed as Frank Howard, a kind, elderly man offering employment to 10-year-old Grace's older brother. Gaining the family's trust, he convinced them to let Grace accompany him to a supposed party. She never returned. Years later, in 1934, Fish sent a letter to Grace's parents detailing her murder and cannibalization, horrifying the nation and ultimately leading to his arrest. Fish was a confessed masochist with a penchant for inserting needles into his body and self-inflicted torture. He claimed his crimes were driven by voices and delusions, though many believed he was fully aware of his actions. At his trial, psychiatrists described him as one of the most deranged individuals they'd ever encountered. Albert Fish was executed by electric chair in 1936, but his case remains one of the most disturbing in criminal history, a story of pure evil cloaked in frailty and deception. In July 1960, the charred remains of a young girl aged between 3 and 6 were discovered in a remote desert near Congress, Arizona. Clad in a checkered blouse and sandals too large for her small frame, she had been buried hastily in a shallow grave. Authorities could not identify her, so she was tragically nicknamed Little Miss Nobody. The case immediately baffled investigators. The girl's cause of death was unclear due to the state of her remains, but foul play was strongly suspected. Despite nationwide efforts to uncover her identity, including publicizing her description and a reconstruction of her face, no family or guardian ever came forward. Little Miss Nobody was laid to rest in a local cemetery, her headstone bearing the heartbreaking inscription, "Little Miss Nobody, blessed are the pure in heart." For years, her grave became a symbol of hope and sorrow as the town continued to wonder who she was and why no one claimed her. Decades passed with few leads, but advances in forensic technology rekindled hope. In 2022, her remains were exhumed, and with the help of modern DNA testing, she was finally identified as Sharon Lee Gallegos, a 4-year-old girl abducted from Alamogordo, New Mexico in 1960. Sharon's tragic story revealed she had been taken by strangers, but the exact details of her murder remain a mystery. Little Miss Nobody's case underscores the power of modern science and the enduring pursuit of justice, even decades after a crime. The Keddie Cabin Murders, a chilling cold case. Introduction. In 1981, a quiet vacation resort in the small town of Keddie, California, became the site of one of the most brutal and mysterious murder cases in American history. Known as the Keddie Cabin Murders, this horrific crime claimed 4 lives and left countless unanswered questions that haunt investigators and true crime enthusiasts to this day. The crime scene. On the morning of April 12, 1981, 14-year-old Sheila Sharp returned to her family's cabin, Cabin 28, after spending the night with a neighbor. What she found inside was a scene of unimaginable horror. Her mother, Glenna Sue Sharp, her brother John, 15, and John's friend Dana Wingate, 17, had been brutally murdered. The victims had been bound with electrical wire, bludgeoned, and stabbed. Blood was splattered throughout the cabin, indicating a violent struggle. Disturbingly, Sheila's younger siblings and their friend were unharmed in a nearby bedroom, seemingly unaware of the carnage. The body of Sue's youngest son, 12-year-old Tina, was missing. Her disappearance added another layer of mystery to the case. Tina's remains were discovered 3 years later, over 50 miles away, deepening the tragedy and complicating the investigation. The investigation. The Keddie Cabin Murders baffled law enforcement. Despite the brutality of the crime, evidence was sparse, and the remote location hindered investigative efforts. A hammer, knife, and bloodied weapons were found at the scene, but no definitive fingerprints or DNA linked to a suspect. Several leads and suspects emerged over the years, including Martin Smart, a neighbor with a violent history, and his friend John Beau Boubaid. Allegations of police incompetence or even cover-ups swirled around the case, further muddying the waters. Lingering questions. The case remains officially unsolved, though advancements in forensic technology and renewed interest have kept it in the public eye. Recent efforts by amateur sleuths and true crime enthusiasts have unearthed new evidence, but the lack of clear answers continues to torment the families of the victims. Why this case resonates. The Keddie Cabin Murders are chilling because of their senseless brutality, the eerie survival of the children in the next room, and the questions of whether justice was intentionally obstructed. This case speaks to the human fascination with the unknown and the hope that someday even the darkest mysteries can be solved.